Welcome everyone to the final class of our 6-week online course on New England research. My name is Ginevra Morse. I'm the Director of Education and Online Programs at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be moderating today's event. So in this last class, we'll tackle the final state in our overview of New England family history, and that being Connecticut. Our presenter and instructor today is Chris Child, Senior Genealogist of the Newbury Street Press and editor of the Mayflower Descendant. Chris has worked for various departments at American Ancestors since 1997 and became a full-time employee in 2003. He has been a member of American Ancestors since the age of 11. He has written several articles in American Ancestors magazine, the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, and the Mayflower Descendant. He is the co-editor, co-author, or author of several Newbury Street Press books, including The Ancestry of Catherine Middleton and The Descendants of Judge John Lowell of Newburyport, Massachusetts. His areas of expertise include Southern New England, especially Connecticut, New York, ancestry of notable figures, especially presidents, genetics and genealogy, African American and Native American genealogy, 19th and 20th century research, westward migrations out of New England, and applying to hereditary societies. So again, similar to our other classes in this course, Chris will begin by giving you kind of a brief history of the state, followed by some go-to published guides and references. And much of tonight's class will be focused on what records exist, how to find them, and how to make the most of these resources in your family history research. And then we'll wrap up with a case study and a look at some additional repositories. You'll find a PDF of today's slides at the online course page, and as well as a handout. Starting tomorrow, you'll be able to watch a recording of today's presentation on that course page. And one final note before moving on, of course, we are still broadcasting from our homes to your home with various limitations and distractions. We do apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end. We thank you for your patience and for bearing with us. If we do lose the connection for any reason, you will still have access to a full recording on that webpage. And again, please make sure that you remain muted throughout the presentation. You will be able to ask questions by typing them into the chat panel, and Chris will answer as many as he can during 3 Q&A sessions. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Chris.
Thanks, Ginevra, and good evening, everyone. I myself grew up in northeastern Connecticut, where 1/4 of my ancestry is derived. I've researched in Connecticut on the state and local level and have utilized resources helpful for Connecticut research that are not in Connecticut. So this talk will give an overview of many of these records, as well as a few case examples where certain methods of research have come into play. In terms of the earliest English settlements, the earliest settlements of Hartford, Wethersfield, can somewhat be described as second-generation settlements, as well as New Haven from Massachusetts Bay, but all within a decade of the prior Massachusetts settlements. While Rhode Island was settled with more bitter religious differences, these early Connecticut settlements were somewhat friendlier in nature. The Hartford settlement thought the tenets of the Massachusetts Bay Church were a bit too strict, while the New Haven settlement felt that they were not strict enough. Settlements were largely on the Connecticut River and on the coast. Northeastern Connecticut was settled in 1686, first as New Roxbury, Massachusetts, from English folks from, you guessed it, Roxbury, Massachusetts. Also, Suffield, Connecticut was part of Massachusetts initially. The area of northwestern Connecticut was the last area to be settled by English, not until the mid-18th century, and I generally consider this to be one of the more difficult areas of research in Connecticut. Now, obviously there were indigenous settlements prior to the English arrival, but as result of several 17th century conflicts, the native settlements may have moved by the time English people arrived, and later native settlements in Connecticut were from elsewhere in New England originally. As an example, John Eliot, known as the Apostle to the Indians, did preach to Native Americans in 1674 in what is known as Pulpit Rock in present-day Woodstock, Connecticut. However, as a result of King Philip's War, the native population in this area had largely died or moved elsewhere, and Woodstock appeared to be a vacant lot in 1686 with that initial English settlement. Later groups of African and indigenous settlements would return or move to these areas, although their treatment in government records can be considerably scattered. There are specific Connecticut resources for families of color. There are 2 books by Marcella Houle-Passé, one specific to Black and Native families, and the other an abstract of court records. Some records that are come into play for other New England states as well, such as warnings out, apprenticeships, and court records, the last of which I mentioned a bit later, can also be useful. There had been a website on GeoCities by Thomas Doughton, which is archived, which abstracted families of color from vital records for several northeastern Connecticut towns. Generally, people people of color will start to be included in the main vital records in Connecticut starting in the mid-19th century. And while the Earl Report of 1861 was for Native Americans in Massachusetts, for Nipmunks living along the border, this can be a useful resource when families live between Massachusetts and Connecticut. I'll go through a few published resources specific to New England and Connecticut. The first of which has been mentioned by the other speakers is, of course, our Handbook for New England Research. This is especially useful since Connecticut is so town-centric, with the caveat on probate districts that I'll get into. And this book provides very useful tables for the towns and other useful resources. These 3 works are part of our classic reprint series, and I give the forward for 2 of these in a more recent printing. Barber's work on Connecticut historical collections provides a snapshot of Connecticut from the colonial period to 1830, with summaries of the towns divided by counties, with several colonial records abstracted, such as the list of planters of New Haven in 1643 and all the landholders of Hartford in 1639. Hinman's work on the first Puritan settlers of Connecticut was an earlier attempt at sort of a Connecticut genealogical dictionary, which unfortunately really only goes to the letter H, but then does have other historical lists of interest. Goodwin's work concerns 47 families of New England, including Connecticut governors John Webster and Thomas Wells, and it's kind of a hodgepodge of various Connecticut families from the colonial period to the time of publication. All of these published works should be looked at as early attempts, with checking new bibliographies such as Martin Hollick's New Englanders in the 1700s and Robert Charles Anderson's The Great Migration Directory. I'll now go through several key records for Connecticut, which fortunately have a variety of ways of access, especially for this time period. I'll go through the Barber collection in greater detail, which is largely the statewide index to vital records in Connecticut before 1850. A handful of towns were not included in the Barber collection, which are Bolton, Coventry, Enfield, Mansfield, New Haven, Norwich, and Vernon, because a published version of vital records had already been created. A small edition for Woodstock, Connecticut is included in the Barber collection, although a more comprehensive transcription of Woodstock vital records to the 1850s had also been published. If you are at the Connecticut State Library in Hartford, most of these records are in a vast card catalog and will also include references to other manuscript materials such as the Brown Diary of Woodstock and several other smaller resources. Within these card catalog indexes are also the Hale collection, which I'll describe in more detail, and the Congregational Card Index, which is not every church record, only congregational ones. The State Library still has a lot of original manuscript material on other church records, as well as Family Search, which has microfilmed and digitized nearly all of these card indexes. These congregational church records divided by town are also now available on Ancestry.com. A key thing to consider, especially for the 17th and 18th century in Connecticut and New England is that many of these towns have small populations and residents tend to marry one another. A consequence of this is it can be a very common occurrence to attach someone of the same name in the wrong family. This chart of my own ancestry shows 11 different descents from the same family that lived in northeastern Connecticut. Over the years, I've corrected several parts of this chart where a female ancestor had been placed in the wrong family when my actual ancestor was either their first or second cousin of the same name born around the same time. So going now specifically to the Barber collection, this is named for the manager of the project, Lucius Barnes Barber, although the actual chief transcriber was James Newell Arnold, who's known for Arnold's Vital Record of Rhode Island and Vital Record of Rehoboth, Massachusetts. This version first was released at the Connecticut State Library and was made as a card index in town books. These works were microfilmed by Family Search and are now available digitally there. Another reproduction was published in the late 1990s by Genealogical Publishing Company, credited as being compiled by Lorraine Cook White. This version is available on Ancestry.com. NEHGS also has Barber's original manuscript with records until 1870, which is available on AmericanAncestors.org. Within both the statewide and town volumes, you see the references to the original volume and page number. By and large, you can generally now look at the originals of these records on Family Search. There have been some times where the version on Family Search was also a later transcription, and I have needed to go to the town hall to look at the original record. This is relatively rare. Although a mistranscription can occur, this is a reliable account of the vital records. Although, of course, it's an alphabetical list, and there is value in looking at the records as they occurred, as generally vital events for this time period were recorded by family unit, which is not as apparent when looking at the Barber version. The other major index for Connecticut is known as the Hale Collection, put together by Charles R. Hale, and is a vast collection of tombstone inscriptions and marriage and death announcements from local newspapers. Some of the gravestone inscriptions can be stones no longer standing, and similar to Barber, this is a card index from the State Library with bound books. All of these have been scanned and digitized by Family Search and are also largely available on Ancestry.com. Now, the information on the cards is somewhat limited, and it is strongly recommended to look at the full reference. Graves may only have years, when the full transcription will provide the date of death and exact age. Also, newspaper announcements will likely have more information. In this example, this index, which is of the version on Ancestry, shows Sarah Latimer died at New London, Connecticut on 26 April 1853, aged 88 years. However, in looking at the Hale book, much more information is provided. Sarah actually died in Carlton, New York, but the paper was the New London Chronicle. This identifies Sarah as Sarah Lee rather than Sarah Latimer, and as the widow of Dan Lee, formerly widow of Walter H. Gould and the daughter of Henry Latimer. Obviously, this is a lot more information than that initial index entry. Vital records in 1853 rarely stated parents' names and especially did not state two spouses, and vital records in New York actually were largely non-existent for this time. While Sarah was a native of the New London area, she had moved to New York. However, I would also now recommend going to the original newspaper article. There are several sites now with digitized newspapers, such as newspapers.com, Newspaper Archive, and Genealogy Bank. Sometimes the paper may only be available at a local repository, such as the State Library or a town public library. However, for records within the Hale collection, I have found Genealogy Bank to be the most comprehensive for most of these 19th century newspapers. You can see here that Sarah's full death notice, it indicated much more information, that she died at the residence of her son in Carlton. Also said that her husband Dan Lee was of Lyme, Connecticut, that she fled for her safety when Benedict Arnold ordered the burning of New London during the Revolutionary War, and that Sarah was the mother of 10 children, 6 of them survive, and the youngest is near 40 years of age. With Sarah dying at age 88, this meant she had children right until nearing 50 years old. Another newspaper that has had a useful genealogical focus is the Hartford Times. This had a genealogical column from 1918 until 1967. This column is very similar to the Boston Evening Transcript, where readers submitted and answered queries. If you're the most reason you'd be familiar with the Boston Evening Transcript is because it's indexed in the American Genealogical and Biographical Index by the Godfrey Memorial Library. So this is a similar thing, but it is not used as much. NEHGS, the Family History Library, and the Connecticut State Library all have a microfilm and a print version of this column with an index, and some portions of this column from the Hartford Times are available digitally from Family Search.
All right, well, thanks, Chris. So let's pause here, see if there are any questions before moving on. So Stephen says you mentioned the pre-Barber index collections for towns like Coventry, Enfield, Norwich, and others. He asks, where can these volumes be found? And specifically, do you know the author and title for the Norwich records?
Sure. So that all of those you can generally find on archive.org. If you browsed our library catalog on library.nehgs.org, you could find them all, and we have always provided a Hathitrust link to these titles when they exist. All of these are well out of copyright, so they have all been digitized. If you were in our library or the Connecticut State Library, they would also always be there. I believe for the Norwich title, I believe its technical title is Vital Records of Norwich, Vital Records for the City of Norwich, Connecticut, Vital Records of Norwich 1659 to 1848. Because it was actually directly done, it doesn't have a specific author. But if you did a keyword search on our catalog, you would get, if you just did keyword for Norwich Vital Records, you would get to the link, and then it would actually provide you a link to the online database on AmericanAncestors.org.
All right. And Grace asks, are the Hale and Barber collections that you mentioned, are those acceptable sources when applying to the DAR?
So yes, they are. I mean, for the most part, I mean, the Hale collection or Barber, those are generally acceptable on DAR applications. They're a transcription of the record. I mean, many times on we've worked on, especially for Barber itself. I mean, for Hale, it's an index, and it is. I would generally recommend to try to either get a photograph of the gravestone or get the original newspaper. I believe they can also be used in the in DAR applications, but definitely for Barber, yes, that's been used quite a lot.
And Robert asks or says, you mentioned a number of newspaper subscription sites, many of which cost money, lots of money for the subscriptions. Which would you say is kind of the best overall for genealogy, and not just for Connecticut papers, but kind of in general?
Sure, and then I'm just going to answer this in my experience and based on kind of the type of research that I do geographically and by time period. I finished finished this genealogy on a family that started in Rhode Island, that had a lot of presence in Connecticut as well as a lot of southern states as well. I think for the 18th century in the New England states, I would generally go with Genealogy Bank for the 1800s, for the late 1700s and 1800s specifically. However, once you get into the late 1800s and the 1900s, and especially once you're leaving New England, I probably had the best luck with newspapers.com. Again, I've also found things I want on Newspaper Archive as well. Since we have work accounts to all of them, I haven't and I sort of use them when I need them. I haven't necessarily, that's not been as principally my concern. But I would say Genealogy Bank and Newspapers.com are the two that I use the most. And I would say for probably 1850 to 1950, I use Newspapers.com more. And perhaps a little bit more out of New England, and then for the federal period of New England from 1750 to 1850, I definitely use Genealogy Bank a lot more.
So it kind of sounds like no one-stop shop for for newspapers, that it really maybe depends on time period and location, and that some are better than others based on that.
Yeah, and I mean, you can go on all of these websites to see what they've got. And like I said, for the stuff that's often transcribed in Hale Collection, I've usually been able to find the original paper on Genealogy Bank. But yeah, not everything. And so there's some crossover between the sites where one site will have a collection of a paper from, say, 1840 to 1890, and then another website will have it from 1900 to 1920. So it runs the gamut.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that I believe you mentioned that you can kind of start to see people of color, Native Americans being listed in Connecticut vital records starting in the mid 18th or mid 19th century. Andrew's asking, would you find people of color in records from the 1600s, and how might they be listed, or are there special resources when researching families of color in earlier time periods in Connecticut?
I mean, they would, if they are identified with any racial classification, would be generally given the language of the time, so they may be called an Indian or an African or Negro or mulatto or anything like that. They would, I mean, occasionally you would find them in like regular vital records. Most of the time you might find them in court records or other resources. The other records that I had mentioned, like warnings out, those are more for Massachusetts, but occasionally, I mean, for Native Americans, they may be there will be very early deeds where they would be mentioned. It definitely can be very sporadic in terms of how they are going to be referenced, especially for the 17th century. Like I said, they don't get to start to be sort of uniformly carried in the sort of records of in the sort of town government records until starting in the 1850s. So it's definitely more difficult. I've worked on families that we can trace them back to, say, like Native American or Black ancestors, say in the late 1700s, but it's sometimes just getting the whole genealogy from one person to the next is a little difficult. I do give a later example where it definitely is a family of color in that goes back to the 1700s, and they're not identified as being of color in most of the records. They're just identified with their names.
And you brought up one point where, especially in kind of early New England, talking about the 17th, maybe early 18th centuries, where people of this, people have the same names. I feel like there's just a short list of names that people could choose from, and everyone's named that. What are some of the strategies that you would recommend if you're trying to kind of tease out who belongs to which family? And I know that's a big question, but I think that is something that people come across on a pretty regular basis when doing especially early New England research.
Yes, and I mean, the probate and land records are usually the ones that my sort of go-to resources for first trying to figure out who a person, how they can properly belong into a family if the names can get confused. And I generally try to keep a very wide focus, not just look at probate and land records for the parents of the possible people, but unmarried siblings, unmarried aunts or uncles, anyone who might have had something that could have potentially listed heirs, and listed heirs with sort of more specific relationships defined, and or if women by their married names. You can always look for some other records like diaries or anything like that. Once you get to after the Revolutionary War, pensions can sometimes be a good resource, but by and large, probate and land are usually my first go-to sources before getting into some more esoteric records.
Okay, and Douglas asks, does the Godfrey Memorial Library have newspapers that you know of?
Yes, they do. The Connecticut State Library does. The Connecticut Historical Society does as well. I mean, they all have their own collections, and so they will all have their own collections of papers. I think the Connecticut State Library probably has the most comprehensive, but I'm not sure on the numbers for between them all. They do all have material.
And speaking about newspapers, Lee asks, where can we find a comprehensive list of Connecticut newspapers, maybe by towns that they covered up to the mid-19th century? Lee says, I have had a very difficult time finding records for persons who lived in North Groton, Second Society, later called Ledyard. So where would you go to find kind of a listing of what newspapers existed for Connecticut, maybe the towns that they covered, time periods, and are there other strategies in kind of finding those newspapers? I mean, you gave an example of, I think it was maybe the Hartford Times or some other newspaper covering parts of New York. So, I mean, would you go beyond Connecticut when searching newspapers?
Sure. I mean, and that example I gave was the New London Chronicle, and that covered a New London native who had died in New York, and that was the reason she was covered there. I would generally start with the Connecticut State Library catalog to see what newspapers they have, and then I would probably try local libraries right around Groton, Connecticut to see what material they have. Those would be generally just to see sort of the list of what papers existed, and it's also just sort of finding who might still have those records. Usually the state and local library are going to be your best bets to have the original records. The websites I had mentioned are your best bet to sort of get access to them right away online, but that's going to be definitely not the totality of all papers that would have existed.
And certainly Chronicling America, the Library of Congress resource, is another place to look for newspapers, not just for Connecticut, but across America. So that's another resource. And then Kathy, one final question before moving on, because I know we have a lot to talk about probate records, but Kathy asks, what about the Acadian expulsion? I have a reference to an ancestor who was dropped off by the British in Connecticut and made his way north back to his family. Do you see Acadians moving to Connecticut?
I haven't had that much experience regarding that. I mean, generally, I would see if the town the person was living in Connecticut to try histories of that particular town, and then either try town records there that might make reference to how he was specifically taken, how he or she was taken in that particular town, and then how they may have returned back north. I just have not really dealt with that in terms of having a Connecticut connection.
All right. So it looks like those are all the questions. So let's move on to probate records, and I'll turn it back over to you, Chris.
All right, thanks. So I'll now venture into Connecticut probate records, and this could be a whole talk on its own, as I have done so at some of our Connecticut events. So Connecticut began in the 1630s as an English settlement in 3 different colonies called Connecticut, New Haven, and Saybrook. Saybrook joined Connecticut colony in the 1640s. King Charles II mandated union with New Haven in 1662. It took a few years, however, for New Haven to comply with this mandate. During this early period in Connecticut history, each colony had its own legislature called the General Court. The upper house of this legislature would sit as a court called the Particular Court for criminal and civil proceedings. Probate records in the small colonies were processed in these courts. Although most probate records at this period are found in these courts, there are some exceptions, most relating to coping with the distance of travel from all points of the colony to Hartford in what are today Fairfield and New London counties. From 1649 to 1666, there were special particular courts in addition to the particular courts sitting in Hartford. Estates filed in the special courts are available today only in the originals and microfilm copies of the Fairfield and New London probate districts, and these are now also digitized on Family Search as well. A few probate records from 1639 to 1649 are scattered in town records, such as those of Guilford and Stamford. After quite a few years of foot dragging, New Haven Colony joined Connecticut Colony as required under the Charter of 1662. It was also at this time that the first 4 original counties were established in Connecticut. They were Fairfield, New Haven, New London, and Hartford. In May of 1666, probate courts were established in those counties. Although these county-level probate courts predate the probate district system, their records can now be found as the earliest records of the first 4 probate districts. From 1687 to 1688, during the reign of Governor Edmund Andros over New England, probate records were again filed with the particular court, but for this period of 1686 to 89, estates valued at more than £50 were filed in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. A publication of the particular court records during this period was transcribed by Annie Elliott Trumbull, and a list of the estates over £50 processed in Suffolk County, Massachusetts was published in the American Genealogist in volumes 12 to 14. All of these are also now available online. In 1698, probate districts were established. The first 4 were the original 4 county probate courts. In 1719, the process of splitting districts began. By 1900, there were over 100 probate districts, and then the number approached 140. The continuous process of subdividing probate districts has a very real impact on your ability to find records. You'd need a crib sheet that tells you each and every district was daughtered off from its parent district. Then you need to sit down and determine which district or parent district the records for a person dying in a particular year would be located. Fortunately, there are 2 widely available such sheets. For handbooks to the Handbook to New England Research that I had mentioned earlier would be the first place to go, and Charles William Manwaring's A Digest of Early Connecticut Probate Records contains 2 appendixes located at the front of the first volume. One concerns the daughtering off towns, and the other the daughtering off of probate districts, and has transcriptions of early probate records from 1635 to 1750. Another source for very early probate records are the public records of the colony of Connecticut, which are digitally available mostly on archive.org. Connecticut probate records from the probate district system are widely available in microfilm format and have been more recently digitized by Family Search. There are 3 resources to consult when doing a thorough probate record search. The statewide index to probate packages, not to the probate record books, which were submitted to the local probate courts to the state library for archival purposes from the earliest records going back to the 1640s to 1880. This one massive index is arranged by name of the deceased as well as by the name of the child for whom guardianship papers were filed. Each card shows the name of the deceased, the town of residence, the year the estate was filed, plus 2 important facts: the name of the probate district and the docket number. Each index card contains the quantity of each type of document filed at the probate package for that estate. Probate packages for each probate district were filmed in order by docket number. These could include all the paperwork submitted to the court for each estate, such as wills, distributions, administrators' bonds, accounts, receipts, and selections of guardians, as well as other document types. Nearly all of the probate district packages have been filmed up to 1880, and many have been filmed and digitized to 1915. These are what would be referred to as probate packets or loose papers. I mean, generally this is very similar to all the other states. Probate records can be very important for clarifying relationships and siblings buying out remaining heirs, among many, many other reasons. Besides the loose original papers, the other record in Connecticut are probate court record books. These are arranged chronologically by session. Each book includes records of all business conducted in each session, such as administrative or guardianship books, will transcripts, inventory transcripts, and other business. Most probate record books have been filmed to 1915. It is important to look in both packages and in the probate record books for each and every probate you research. The Connecticut State Library has the loose papers on microfilm, and as I mentioned, they are digitized starting in the 17th century and going up to the early 20th century, and there's a slip index covering these records. This slip index is digitized and available on microfilm at NEHGS as well. Here's an example of an index card found on the loose card sheet. This tells you that Asa T. Child resided in Woodstock, and that that was the district of Woodstock, and the date was 1860, and it consists of a bond and an inventory and account of administration for 3 total documents. From personal experience, I can tell you that Stamford is not included in the loose papers index. The state library has a separate index to this, and that's also at NEHGS, and it's available online. So it's always good to check the probate books too, and not just rely on loose papers. You would expect loose papers to exist if a will was probated, and that's how I learned about Stamford not being included in the index. The state library has microfilm of probate books on site. When you search probate books for the existence of an estate, you'll be looking at the individual volumes, which usually span a couple of years. Since not all estates were probated immediately after death, searching indexes a few years after death is advised. Guardianship records might be indexed among the decedent estates, or might also be listed together in a special guardian or minor section, so bear that in mind. Also, sometimes I've seen indexes at the back of these books, not just the front, so just to keep you on your toes. The Connecticut State Library also does have the original loose papers, so if microfilms are illegible or the packet of interest has not been microfilmed and digitized, the original documents can be reviewed. But obviously this is more of a process, especially in our current situation. Now, Ancestry.com has a collection called Connecticut Wills and Probate Records 1609 to 1999, where lots of the probate records have been digitized and are searchable. While this has definitely been a time saver for me, this online collection is not without its flaws. For one, just the example, what is meant by 1609 to 1999? The 1609 record shown here is actually a 1699 record, since there were no probate records filed in 1609. And the 1999 record is actually an 1899 record, although on this page it really does say 1999. Basically, this collection that's on Ancestry goes from the 1640s to around 1915. It does have a handful of records of probates that were started in 1915 but not completed till much later in the 1940s. But if you do not find your person in the Ancestry collection, there are a lot of additional options, as I have discussed. I'd mentioned Stamford, and in my handout I also mentioned abstracts of Fairfield probates. I also noticed that there was an abstract of Wyndham probate records in this volume that extended to Ashford, Connecticut, and this is another example where I didn't find a probate of someone I was searching for in either the probate books or the loose papers. So probate can be a bit of a maze to make sure you looked at everything. The Connecticut State Library does have finding aids online for each district, and this can provide some very useful information for district by district as well as town by town. I give this example from my grandfather's hometown of Woodstock, Connecticut. So here you can see from 1686 to 1731 it was part of Suffolk County, Massachusetts. Then from 1731 to 1749 it was part of Worcester County, Massachusetts. And 1749 it got annexed to Connecticut, and until 1752 was part of Wyndham District. From 52 to 1831 Pomfret District, 1831 to 2011 Woodstock District, and then from 2011 to the present the Northeast Probate District. So this kind of shows you all the different places you might need to go, and don't necessarily think that these years to be absolutely fluid. Don't be surprised if something might be in the record book from the earlier district or the later district if it's not just in sync with these years, because sometimes it was hard to get them in necessarily the right district when it was changing very quickly. As a last resort, if you don't come up with anything in the loose papers or probate books, you may also want to check out the library's Connecticut archives books, which can be found in the main research room there. They have also been digitized and can be accessed through the website of the Connecticut State Library. The ones of interest here are estates of deceased persons, estates of incompetent persons, and estates of minors. These books are going to list people who are named in material held at the State Library. Now moving on to land records, which for the most part do not have much quirks when it comes to Connecticut. They are very much just at the town level. The earliest land was granted to proprietors who then distributed the land within the town. They are nearly all at the town level except for the border towns of Woodstock and Suffield, which were once part of Massachusetts. During that period, they would be within Massachusetts County land records. While there is no statewide index, nearly all of the land records to roughly 1900 have been digitized on Family Search and are browsable. The two places to look on microfilm, if you happen to be here, are the Connecticut State Library and the Family History Library. Fortunately, the latter's digitization efforts have allowed us to be able to access this mostly from home, provided all agreements are met. And this is going to be the situation where you may see a key, and that's generally because the custodians of these records have to have specific agreements with the Family History Library. So if they can, they'd like you to be able to access them from home. Sometimes you do need to be at a family history center. Land records are going to tell you when someone lived in the town and can provide clues about where someone came from before they lived there and where they went to after they left. They can be a way to determine or prove family relationships because often relatives deeded land to each other or appear in the land descriptions as neighbors. In order to search land records, you'll have to consult the grantee and grantor indexes. Usually next to each grantee entry, you will find who the grantor was and vice versa, so that might help you pinpoint which records you want to consult, and is particularly useful if you're using land records to try to determine family relationships. The grantee and grantor books are then going to refer you to the land record volumes which contain the deeds. But I would advise that many deeds can be recorded decades and sometimes a full generation or two later. So I'll go into your earliest land records, which I had mentioned are the proprietor's records. These records do not necessarily contain that much detail, but are your first records, and because they are brief, many have broader availability. These records will be at town halls, the Connecticut State Library, and the Family History Library, and many are going to be at NEHGS. Take in mind that while for other deeds there is the county exception for Woodstock and Suffield, proprietor records exist at the town level for those two towns, formerly in Massachusetts. Many are digitized now by Family Search and have published transcriptions available. This is published proprietor's records from Waterbury, Connecticut by a local historical society. And in this case, it identifies the owner, their lot number, and how large in acres their property is. Tax records can also, while used less often in Connecticut genealogy, can also indicate that your ancestor was paying a real estate tax and owned land. So that could be a clue to check up on some land records if you find your ancestor in some tax records. Some tax records are available through Family Search, and a lot are still kept at local town halls. So just because Family Search happened to, their main focus was getting vital land and probate records, there can definitely be some value into going to town halls to see what else they might not have gotten scanned when they had a chance. However, your ancestor did not need to live in a community to own land there. And this is an example here in my own ancestry where I descend from John Lyon and Elizabeth Newell. They married in Roxbury, Massachusetts in the late 17th century and later lived in Rehoboth, Massachusetts. There was an issue of which Elizabeth Newell she was, whether she was the daughter of Abraham Newell or his brother Isaac, as they both had daughters named Elizabeth. Now, keep in mind, neither John and Elizabeth nor Abraham or Isaac or their wives ever lived in Connecticut. However, the solution to which Elizabeth was mine was actually found in land records concerning land in Woodstock, Connecticut, then part of Massachusetts. Abraham Newell of Roxbury died in 1691, and while his will mentioned his daughter Elizabeth, she was unmarried when he wrote his will. While he never lived in Woodstock, he had apparently been granted land there, and he had appeared in the proprietor's records. And as I had mentioned, this area was settled by people from Roxbury as the town of New Roxbury. This deed was written in 1721, but was not filed until 1731. So in 1721, Woodstock was part of Suffolk County, Massachusetts, but by 1731, it's in the newly created county of Worcester. This early deed for the new county reads that John Lyon of Rehoboth sells land that my father-in-law, Mr. Abraham Newell, late of Roxbury, deceased. So this clearly establishes that my Elizabeth Newell was the daughter of Abraham, not the daughter of Isaac. So useful deeds can be found not always where you might expect. So really keep a broad focus of all the sort of geographic areas families might have had interest in, even if they never lived there themselves. Going back to proprietors' plans for a moment, these can have early maps showing where the lots were and might point to other kinship networks if families were living close by. You'll want to use the proprietor's records to determine the earliest date of settlement, but again, keep in mind they may not be there quite yet or may never actually get there. Another thing to keep in mind with land records is the daughter towns of Connecticut. This is 3 generations of my ancestry. From the land records, you can see that it begins with Thomas Pierce of Plainfield, Connecticut. He appears in records there starting in the early 1700s. And then his daughter Rachel married in Killingly, Connecticut in 1723. And then Rachel's daughter by the 1780s is living in Thompson, Connecticut. However, if you looked at maps, you can see how the towns are now. So at this point, you still have the town of Plainfield as well as Sterling, Killingly, Putnam, and Thompson. But in 1699, only Plainfield existed. Killingly was created in 1708, and then Thompson was created out of northern Killingly in 1785. So in this case, my ancestors never actually moved, but were recorded in records in 3 different towns in less than 80 years.
All right, well, thanks again, Chris. Let's pause here once more and see if anyone has questions. So type them into the chat panel. So Robert asks, in general, are there records from a certain time frame that might be found in Massachusetts archives and not Connecticut? And if so, kind of what record groups and when might you see when might you have to go to Massachusetts, even if you're talking about Connecticut, present-day Connecticut?
Sure. So mostly those are just the 2 border towns, Suffield, Connecticut, and Woodstock, Connecticut, because they were part of Massachusetts initially. But sometimes some of the other towns nearby, I mean, the case I was mentioning for Plainfield, even though they actually always lived in what's clearly Killingly, but because they were close enough to Plainfield, that's why records got recorded there. But for Massachusetts specifically, the other period is those Governor Edmund Andros years from 1686 to 89, when if the estates were over 50 pounds, then those would be filed in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. Again, all of these records have been largely digitized, so the need to physically go to these places is not as much as it had been before. But those are really the only specific situations. But again, families could have had land interest, and if 2 or 3 generations went from one place to another, there may have been land interest back in Massachusetts, even if the families had been living in Connecticut. So you might find something, and it entirely might refer to land in Massachusetts, but it might concern Connecticut residents.
And Susan asks, the Wyndham book that you referenced for probate records, do you know if that's still available? Where might you find that?
Sure. So I included it in our handout. It's in our library. I believe it might still be for sale. I believe it was published by Heritage Books. And I mean, it is in a number of other libraries as well. Since it's actually kind of a new transcription, it's not available. That record itself is not available online. The way I actually found it and alerted our library that we needed to get a copy was I sort of did a Google book search, and I found one of those snippet views and alerted us that we needed to get that copy of book. I think most of those you can generally find in the loose papers or the probate packets, but I found a very specific probate because it concerned the people I was looking for, and I could not find that specific probate in either of the collections. So that was one of the main reasons I said let's get this.
And Catherine asks if you can talk about kind of the collapse of probate districts in 2011.
Yeah, so in 2011, they massively consolidated the probate districts. I don't know the total to how, because they were just based. You would have a probate district, and it would be our surrounding towns, and then as towns got more populations, that would be condensed, and so they would be just massively so many more and more. So yeah, now they are a lot less. So like I was mentioning, Woodstock is now just the northeast probate district. That's just sort of in an effort to consolidate them. I don't do really as much probate research since 2011, but generally I would use those guides that are on the state library's website just to sort of refer to it. And now, probate is handled at those particular courts, and since they have a little bit more generic names, it's not as evident where the specific court would be based out of. But the guides would generally be more specific in additional information.
Thanks. Now, Jean asks, what challenges do you find when researching Northwest Connecticut?
Sure. So, since it's often not settled till the 1750s or 60s, one of the problems is that there's, some, as I was mentioning, some of those early just sort of 17th century resources. There are a lot of just general works that cover a lot of colonial families, like a lot of local histories cover early families starting in the 1700s. Because northwestern Connecticut is a little later, it can be difficult to sort of bridge the gap, and there's not the area doesn't have great sort of genealogical reporting of families at that time. So sorting out who's getting there can be a little trickier. And also sometimes people aren't only there very briefly. They might be going further north up to western Massachusetts or to Vermont state. And also it's getting settled during what can be called the century of lost ancestors from 1750 to 1850. Although Connecticut is generally decent with records, even in this period of 1750 to 1850, there is a sort of dip in record completeness. I'll mention an example later concerning Norwich, Connecticut, where records were minimal for the late 1700s. So the fact that the northwestern Connecticut is not getting settled to this time period adds a little bit of some complications. So I haven't had the best luck there, but there are the same types of records. I've found them to be not as complete.
All right. And Jean asks, could you define daughter towns? So you showed an example of kind of those evolving and changing maps. What do you mean exactly by daughter towns?
Sure. So what I mean there is that a daughter town was created from an earlier town. So like a sort of second generation town. So in the example I was giving was like Killingly when Killingly was created in 1708, it encompassed the present-day towns of Killingly, Thompson, and Putnam. So Thompson would be a daughter town of Killingly because when Thompson was established in 1785, it was created out of northern Killingly. So and Killingly would be considered the parent town of Thompson because Thompson was created out of Killingly. Sometimes a town might have 2 or 3 parent towns, and this is what's really great about the tables in the handbook to New England research, because it lays all of those.
Okay, and Dana asks, you showed an example of tax records. So generally, what time period are you likely to find those tax records, and were they kept at the state level, local level, or both?
Sort of both. I mean, most of the tax records that I've used in genealogy have been at the town level, and generally these will be kept. You could find them within town records. So separate from vital records will be town record books that may refer to how people were taxed. So a lot of times the town records will get scanned by family search. They're often not going to have as great indexes because they were scattered throughout the town record books, but that's usually where you will find them. And they'll go from the 17th century onwards, and obviously there'll be state taxes later. IRS records don't start till the 1860s, and therefore they're very limited to the later period of time. But also because of access and whatever, generally you only would have access to tax records going up to about 1900 or so.
And Rebecca asks, has anyone created kind of a comprehensive timeline of towns in New England, where what town is, evolves from another town? We kind of talked about this a little bit with parent towns and daughter towns. Is there some kind of timeline or way to kind of see how these towns evolve and change over time?
I mean, I've seen the tables to be sort of the best, the tables that are in the handbook really to be the best descriptor. I haven't come across sort of any timeline per se or an evolving map. I mean, some of the sources that I was mentioning, those reprints will give you maps of how Connecticut looked in 1830. And you can see how they looked a little bit later, but I'm not familiar per se with a timeline. The Connecticut Historical Society has had some exhibits that have talked about how Connecticut has changed over the years. It's possible they may have something along those lines.
And also the town guides that we have on our website, we do have one for each New England state as well as New York. Those are linked, those are free on our website, and they're also, you'll find a link to them on the course webpage. So that might be another resource to kind of check out. All right, so with that, I will turn it back over to you, Chris, for the final section of today's class.
All right, thanks. So now, as my last slides had mentioned Killingly and Thompson, Connecticut, I wanted to briefly mention military records. Military records, especially for the Revolution, can be useful for all of New England, especially pension records. The DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution website also has been very useful. While some Connecticut records can get a little light in the 18th century and early 19th century, a Revolutionary War pension may help fill in the gaps. My golden example is my ancestor Joseph Turtelot, who served in the Revolutionary War from the Thompson parish of Killingly. However, his daughter Lucy, my ancestor, was born in 1785, the year that Thompson was incorporated from Killingly officially. While there was no record of Lucy's birth or those of her children, Joseph's pension turned out to be a gold mine. And years ago, the way I would have to look at this, I would have to go to Virgil White's Genealogical Abstracts of Revolutionary War Pensions, but now you can go on Fold3, and to a certain extent, these are also on Ancestry.com. In this case, his pension had this family Bible, which listed not only the births and deaths of Joseph's parents, but also the births of his siblings, the births of Joseph and his wife, the births of his 2 daughters and all of his grandchildren. I could see 4 generations worth of events spanning the year 1725 to 1827 in Gloucester, Rhode Island, and in Thompson, Connecticut. These 2 pages had 34 birth dates, 26 being full dates of birth, 8 being years only, and 2 death dates, none of which I had found in vital records of Connecticut or Rhode Island. The gravestones of Joseph's parents, Abraham and Phoebe, were at the appropriately named Turtlet Cemetery in Thompson, do have the same death date. So this is one of my great examples, especially when towns are being created, how Rev War pensions can really help. So the final set of records I'll go through to the present day I'll mention are court records, which are probably the records I have used the least. So Charles Hoadley published 2 series of court records for New Haven colony in the 17th century, and the previously mentioned public records of the colony of Connecticut are 15 volumes from 1636 to 1776. These sources are also digitally available online. These early records provide interesting information about alleged crimes and subsequent punishments. In the New Haven records is one of the bizarrest accusations was that George Spencer had fathered a deformed piglet that bore his resemblance. He was subsequently hung and the sow was killed in 1642. Court records are held at the county level and can be challenging to search. You might find out about the existence of a court record through other records. For example, land records may mention that an execution was levied on real estate, which should then help you track down the relevant court documents. Newspapers might also alert you to the existence of a court record. If court records are something you are interested in learning about, you may want to check out the Connecticut State Library's Finding Aid Guide to the Records of the Judicial Department, which is available on their website and will tell you a lot more sort of nitty-gritty details about court records. The particular court was the first to hear probate cases. These records have been published and in this above source from 1639 to 1663, which is also referred to in your handout. The Trial Court of Assistants handled cases from 1665 to 1711, and we published the minutes of this court 11 years ago. The associate editor of the Register, Helen S. Ullman, transcribed those records. And the Trial Court of Assistants was replaced by the Superior Court in 1711. The Superior Court was obviously the highest court, but there were county level courts until 1855 and then the justice courts until 1961. Today there are district courts, county superior courts, and the state Supreme Court. This is one of the few instances where county has any meaning in Connecticut when it comes to civil and criminal court. Very recent court records can be found on the Connecticut's Judicial Branch website, and these can be useful for paternity issues when fathers are not on the birth certificate. And you can sort of get a decent amount of just public information from searching these records online for the last several years. So now I'll jump ahead to late 19th and early 20th century resources. In the 19th century, you'll get immigration from Quebec, especially Europe and elsewhere. Naturalization and declarations of intent are now largely available digitally from Family Search and also sometimes on Ancestry.com. Generally, they are less detailed than Massachusetts. If you have Irish ancestors, most of the time they just say Ireland, especially for the 1800s, and they do not give a county or townland. From the mid-20th, for the 20th century, there was the St. Albans Border Crossing Index. While Rhode Island and Massachusetts had some useful state indexes, Connecticut did not, but we did have a World War I questionnaire which had some additional data beyond what's in your normal World War I draft registration card. And to explain what the St. Albans border crossing, if you're not familiar, that is generally crossings between the United States and Canada, not just specifically St. Albans, Vermont. Now, starting in 1897 is when the health department requires a copy of vital records being sent to Hartford. Birth records in Connecticut are considered confidential except to the people on the record or for members of Connecticut Incorporated Genealogical Societies. Now, I provide the list of these such societies in the handout. I started going to town halls to do research at 14 years old. Initially, I was allowed to look at the records, but then they told me that since I was not yet 16, I could not look at my own birth certificate, so I could not look at anyone else's. I then came back at 16 years old, and I was told I needed to be a member of a genealogical library. I showed them my membership to NEHGS and was ultimately told that that was approved one since it was not incorporated in Connecticut. I then tried to join the Connecticut Society of Genealogists, but they told me I could not join until I was 18. I then joined the Killingly Historical Society, and this time was told that I needed to actually be 18 to look at full birth certificates. When I came back again at 18, I had no problem. All records after 1897 are at the health department in Hartford, Connecticut, and in the past you could make appointments there on Tuesdays and Thursdays. There have been some recent cuts, and with everything going on now, I'm not completely sure what's possible. And I've gone there many, many times, and when you prepare it right, you can really get a lot of 20th century records right away. There are marriage and death indexes from 1897 to 1999 on the Connecticut State Library website. And then there are some other smaller marriage, death, and divorce indexes on Ancestry.com. Another thing to always be on the lookout for are the collections on Family Search. While we have the Barber collection to 1850 and the statewide index after 1897, the period of 1850 to 1897 has historically had no statewide index, but more and more indexing is being done on Family Search. There are more possibilities for this previously tricky period of time because there wasn't anything really on the statewide level. It was all really town by town, and of course our ancestors moved. So I always often check to see what sort of statewide collections are coming up on Family Search. And as I get into this case study, I would like to indicate, like my Elizabeth Newell Lyon example, not all Connecticut problems will be solved in Connecticut. This case study involves the Rogers family of Western New York. So in this case, the client descended from Ebenezer Rogers of Albion, Orleans County in Western New York State. At the New York State Library in Albany, they had found amongst transcribed Bible records by the New York Daughters of the American Revolution the following Bible transcription, which appeared to show Ebenezer Rogers was born in 1769, and with people that appeared to be his siblings that had some fairly distinct names, Benjamin Shaw Rogers, Nathan Caswell Rogers, and Alicia Merrick Rogers. A history of Orleans County, New York, had indicated that Ebenezer was born in Norwich, Connecticut. However, births were very sporadic there at the time, and no record of Ebenezer nor any of these siblings was found. However, the names were definitely from Norwich. In Norwich, there was an Alicia Merrick who was married to a Grace Rogers, and then there was also a Nathan Caswell who had married the daughter of a Benjamin Shaw. So they were definitely family names in the area. I started to chart out if there could be a member of the Rogers family of Norwich that could be a father of Ebenezer. However, Ebenezer had obviously left Connecticut and had gone to New York, and none of these siblings were in Norwich either. I found a few of these suggested siblings had married in Conway, Massachusetts, which is in present-day Franklin County. And I had a theory that if a few children married there, perhaps their parents married there as well. I ultimately, after sort of looking through the index for Franklin County, Massachusetts, and this also goes into sort of your talk on Massachusetts records with how Hampshire, Hampton, and Franklin counties got created in 1812, and then records got split up after that point. It can get a little tricky. But basically, after going through indexes for this area of probate records, I found that there was an 1824 will for George Rogers of Whately, Massachusetts, which was right next to Conway, where some of these brothers had gotten married. In this case, George Rogers was very clear. He mentioned all of those children in the Bible, including Alicia Merrick Rogers, Benjamin Shaw Rogers, and Nathan Caswell Rogers, and even gave Ebenezer the middle name of George. And this is a kind of fun will because these four sons had clearly all left Western Massachusetts, and all he's giving them is $1 apiece because he had probably given them all their inheritance beforehand, and the two other children who are still in the area are getting much more of the estate. In this case, George Rogers descended from James Rogers, a 17th century immigrant to New London, Connecticut. We did have a turn of the century genealogy by James Swift Rogers in our own collection at NEHGS. While George Rogers was mentioned there as a child, he was not carried forward. One might assume that this family in Western New York was not in touch with the author, but not so fast. Lots of these turn-of-the-century genealogies were done by questionnaire. So genealogists would write to everyone of the surname and maintain lots of papers. Finding them can always be a tricky thing. But the genealogy would not indicate where the information came from, but that does not mean the information is necessarily wrong. In this case, James Swift Rogers did fortunately leave his papers to NEHGS. A grandson of Ebenezer Rogers had written back to the author and had even referred to this old Bible listing Ebenezer's siblings. And this is the Bible there at the bottom of this slide. That was the same record that the DIR had transcribed later. This had more information on the Connecticut Rogers family once they were in New York at a time that New York did not have great records. So while we were able to get this family back to colonial Connecticut, the needed documents were a transcribed Bible in Albany, a will in Western Massachusetts, and family correspondence in Boston. These next examples concern some of my child relatives of Woodstock. A great resource is the History of Woodstock, followed by 7 volumes of genealogies of Woodstock families by Clarence Winthrop Bowen. Bowen himself died after volume 6, which only went to the beginning of the letter H. The next 2 volumes were completed in less detail by Donald Lyons Jacobus and William H. Wood. NEHGS has Bowen's manuscript papers. In this example, my ancestor Sarah Child, who married Jedediah Morse and is the grandmother of the inventor Samuel F.B. Morse, is credited as being born in Woodstock in 1722 and the daughter of Benjamin and Patience Child. However, later in the Morse chapter, Jedediah's wife Sarah is listed as born in 1724 and the daughter of John and Abigail Child. In the section for John and Abigail Child, no daughter Sarah in 1724 is given. However, in looking at Woodstock vital records, there definitely was a daughter Sarah born to them in that year. In this case, the solution involved probate records where John Child's youngest son, Shubael Child, bought out all of his siblings. So there wasn't a specific will, but Shubael settled his parents' estate and bought the siblings out. And their signing here was Sarah and Jedediah Morse. I'm not sure what happened to the Sarah Child, daughter of Benjamin, born in 1722, but she is not my ancestor. This research was my first article in the Register, and editor Henry Hoff wanted me to provide a full genealogical summary on John Child's family, and this is where I noticed a few more errors in Bowen, which go back to the issue of common names in a small town. This probate here also shows Hannah and Japheth Bicknell. So this would be another sibling of these Child sisters, would be a Hannah Child married to Japheth Bicknell. However, Hannah Child Bowen had concluded that the Hannah Child who married Japheth Bicknell was the daughter of Ebenezer Child. So that was another correction I fixed, that Hannah was actually the daughter of John Child. The messiest concerns Sarah and Hannah's brother Abijah Child. The summary here would seem to be okay. It says that he married first in October 1748 Priscilla Morse, who actually was a sister of that Jedediah Morse, and that Abijah and Priscilla had a son named Abijah in September of 1749. and that Priscilla died the same day as the son was born, and that Abijah married 15 days later. However, Woodstock Vital Records show a different story. They show that Priscilla and Abijah intended to marry in October 1748, but Priscilla's son Abijah was born not 11 months later, but only 5 months later to a still single Priscilla Morse, and that a still living Priscilla Morse married in 1750 to John Perrin. This was further confirmed in the will of Priscilla's father, John Morse, who left his gun to his grandson Abijah Child. So clearly, Abijah and Priscilla intended to marry, but did not actually do so, although they did have a child together. So in this case, to sanitize an illegitimate birth in 1749, this genealogy written 150 years later twisted some of the facts. Another case, especially in dealing with later marriages, is on the assumption of surnames at marriage. This register family for Amos Green shows that his second wife was Elizabeth Cooper, and that they are a family living in northern Killingly, which later became Thompson, and actually even later became my hometown of Putnam. Earlier vital events of Killingly showed that there were children born to an Abraham and Elizabeth Cooper, which might indicate that the Elizabeth Cooper was a widow when she married Amos Green. Abraham Cooper's probate clearly shows that the widow later was going by Elizabeth Green, so that settles that point. However, what was Elizabeth's maiden name? So we can now list her genealogically as Elizabeth blank Cooper Green. Another source besides the Barber collection for marriages is Bailey's Early Connecticut Marriages from Church Records. You will find marriages here that are not in the Barber collection, and it's an easy source to miss. Fortunately, it's now also searchable on Ancestry, but it wasn't always the case. The marriage here at the bottom of the page is here from the Thompson Church, which was then part of Killingly, and shows Abraham Cooper in 1746 marrying Elizabeth Child. Now, I was assigned this research case because it involves Connecticut. I had no idea that I was going to connect with some of my own relatives. While searching for possible Elizabeths and vital records came up empty, as well as probate records. In this case, the clinching document was a Killingly deed, which referred to lands of Nathaniel and Dorothy Child and mentioned their children, the first being Amos and Elizabeth Green. However, you can see that the next two names are also child couples with wives, and these are Henry and Dorothy Child and Peter and Susanna Child. You see that another Nathaniel Child Jr. is mentioned alone. This would mean that Henry and Peter are sons-in-law and that their wives were the daughters of Nathaniel and Dorothy. And this goes back to the chart I showed earlier showing my multiple child lines. Now, I knew that my ancestor Dorothy Child was a daughter of Nathaniel and Dorothy, and this younger Dorothy Child married Peter Child. However, I also descended from the other couple, Peter Child, who was Henry's brother, and Peter's wife, Susanna Child. However, my notes at this point did not have Susanna as a daughter of Nathaniel and Dorothy. This actually got me back to that same Ebenezer Child who before had been mistakenly given the daughter Hannah Child Bicknell. He was also given the daughter Susanna Child. So that's two women of the same name that were confused for two of his daughters. And fortunately, in this case, we have a probate record and a land record that clearly show that Ebenezer can't be, that his daughters didn't marry those men, that they were other women of the same name. Now, the lesson in looking at records when a woman is mentioned is important. Very rarely will daughters-in-law be mentioned in documents if they are not widowed, or sisters-in-law for that matter. This deed here is from New Milford, Connecticut in 1795 concerning Benjamin Phillips, who was a free person of color and who had died the prior year. Mentioned here are the heirs, Samuel Phillips, Jarrell Phillips, Thaddeus and Huldah Jacqueline, David and Mary Jacqueline, Philip and Elizabeth Phillips, and James and Beulah Jacqueline, all to their brother Reuben Phillips. As a result of this document, numerous online trees list Philip Phillips as a son of Benjamin. But you see here he is listed with his wife Elizabeth. The other Phillips men, Samuel and Jarrell Phillips, are listed alone. Philip Phillips is actually the son-in-law of Benjamin Phillips. Philip Phillips served in the Revolutionary War, and like my ancestor Joseph Turtelot, has a great penchant with original Bible records. Here you see that Philip Phillips' full date of birth in 1762, and his wife Elizabeth Phillips, born in 1764. Within the pension, there is an affidavit from Martha Phillips, who specifically says that she is the cousin of Elizabeth Phillips, and that Phillips was Elizabeth's maiden name. While Elizabeth's family had been free going back to the early 18th century, Phillips' origins are less clear, and if he was born enslaved, he may have taken the family surname of the family he married into. All going to show the importance of seeing a spouse in the deed and making an attachment to the correct parent. So while we are all stuck at home, there are a number of locations to research in Connecticut on site whenever they get open again. We have led several tours at both the Connecticut State Library and the Connecticut Historical Society, but all of which have original records and detailed catalogs and guides. We've done a research tour in New York City a few years back, and have had which do have the manuscripts to the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society. Also, the Godfrey Memorial Library in Middletown, Connecticut, which I mentioned as the makers of AGBI, definitely has a lot of original material there, and their website has a lot of records. I was noticing relatively recently some funeral records and some other unique sources that you could get to from home if you subscribe to that site. And of course, we usually go to Salt Lake City every year. I'm very grateful for the digitization efforts for Connecticut records during this time. This provides my overview of Connecticut resources. I hope everyone can take advantage of the terrific resources available online and in several repositories when they are open again. Connecticut is definitely a state rich in resources, and it's great to utilize these wonderful collections. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Final Q&A of this class and the 6 weeks that we've spent together. So any final questions, go ahead and put them into the chat. And of course, a reminder that if we don't get to your question, or as you start to review the materials and digest this information and questions pop up, you can reach directly, you can reach out to our instructors directly. Their email addresses are on the course webpage, as well as each of the handouts. All right, so Andrew says, you haven't mentioned records in the Oblong, in Western Connecticut. Anything that you want to say about kind of some unique resources for that area, or specifics or strategies when researching that region?
Well, I've mentioned the sort of specifically the Northwestern. In terms of Fairfield County, Connecticut, there in Western Connecticut, I mean, a lot of these records will apply to that area as well. There are some useful guides, like local histories there, like Families of Old Fairfield by Donald Lang Jacobus for early families. And I had mentioned some of these probate records. I mean, most of the time, if it's not any of these statewide specific records, I'll often go to local histories to see what is written about. For Stamford, Greenwich, there was Spencer Mead. He published a lot of original data and histories for that area, and some original records as well. I often will look in our catalog, or the Family History Library catalog, or the State Library catalog, usually for some additional resources. One challenge, though, will be sometimes in that part of Western Connecticut, there might be some crossover to New York, which like in what it becomes Dutchess County, New York, or Washington, I'm forgetting the county right on that side of New York, but there can be, I think it's Newcastle, New York. There can be some back and forth crossover, and then you have to deal with issues with New York for that time period. I've sometimes been able to find some stuff on Western Connecticut families in the Settlers of the Beekman Patent, which is our series on families of a part of Dutchess County, New York, as well.
And Luann asks, where might you find information or records where children were removed from parents, thinking about the mid-1800s? Would those appear in court records, guardianship? Where might you find that information?
Sure. So I would first probably look to guardianship records, which generally are going to be under the gamut of probate records. If it's sort of done by force, it could be something of a court situation, and then that gets into the situation of figuring out where those court records may be located, and or they might be online, but they might still be at the state library. So I would generally think that that would be court or court, specifically court records or guardianship records within the probate gamut.
Thank you. Leslie says, I noticed you listed Connecticut church records 1660 to 1955 as a family search resource and database. Do you have general comments on how complete that data source is?
Sure, and I mean, from that shot of all those databases, basically these are database sets that the Family Search is trying to do. So they're basically putting a lot of different records together. These would be records that were never intended to be initially together, but they sort of all fall under an overall umbrella. It can save you time finding an ancestor if they happen to show up in that record, but if you don't find a person in there, that's definitely not a guarantee that there's not going to be a church record with your person. So you could try it. I've had a lot of good success with using the version of the Connecticut church records on Ancestry.com. That's the congregational card records, congregational church records. But again, I often go to Family Search and just look town by town to see what church records survive, and also look on the Connecticut State Library. If you were there in Hartford, there's a small area of film that is these various church records, especially like other congregations like Baptists, Methodists, Episcopalian, and things like that. Some of those are unique films to the State Library, and I'm not sure how many of those church records have even been filmed by the Family History Library. Some have, but not all of them have. So definitely for those church records, if you don't have success in that collection or the Ancestry's version, try the State Library catalog and the Family History Library catalog.
Now, Ed says, I'm researching an ancestor in New Haven who had a business in the 1850s and 1860s. Any advice on places to find government or business records for that time frame in Connecticut?
Sure. So, I mean, that's definitely at a period where New Haven's a much more established city at that point. Some records could be at the state library, but then also a lot of records may still be kept locally with at the New Haven City Clerk's office. They often try to get records sent over to Hartford after 100 years, but there may still be original records there. And you could also just try to see what the New Haven Library might also have. So I try to say, for a record, things like that, either the state library or things very locally still in New Haven.
All right. Deborah says, I'm specifically interested in Litchfield County records. Any additional suggestions for Litchfield?
Sure. So that's there in northwestern Connecticut, which has its problem. For the time periods, like I said, the mid 1700s get a little tricky, but they are the record system is very similar to the rest of Connecticut, with vital records largely being required, but they're not always going to happen. But then the land records are always going to be at the town level there, and then you have the system of probate districts. You could also try to see, within county histories, within town histories, I'm not really familiar with anything that's terrific for a county history of the Litchfield area. And again, newspapers, depending on the time period you're after, might also be another place to go.
Right. Now, Mary says, if a planter was a founder of New Haven, but not listed in the Grove Street Cemetery, do I make the presumption that he is in the green? Kind of specific, but,
Sure. So, not necessarily. I would, for that specific time period, I would see if your ancestor is listed in the Great Migration series. So you could check the Great Migration directory to see if there's a full sketch written by Robert Charles Anderson. If he is after 1635, You could try some of the other compendia that I referenced, Martin Hollick's New Englanders in the 1700s. This would just get you to some more recent publication on that particular person. And generally within that might be a reference to where the person might be buried. There's going to be lots of colonists where we don't always know where they are buried. Like in Hartford, they have the Founders Monument. There's people on that monument that are not buried there, but they're just on there because they were considered founders of Hartford. A lot of the stones in the mid 1600s were wooden stones, and they just fell. So there's not always going to be the great detailed cemetery records for this specific period of time if they were, depending on how significant the individual was. But I mean for that specific period of time, I try to do the sort of literature search just to see what the best genealogical treatment might be on that person.
Okay. And Lee asks, those quote unquote last resort resources that you mentioned, the Connecticut Archives books, can you find those online? Do you know if those have been scanned, digitized, made available online?
I believe the books themselves, those indexes are, but then to want to look at the records that they're referring to, I believe those are still just at the Connecticut State Library. So you can find those specific books online through the State Library's website. But then if you did want to look at the sort of more detailed court records, then you would, I believe, still need to go to Hartford and request those records there.
Okay, and Martha says, I went to Stanford to find, an old death certificate and other items, and was told I need a card to access really old records. Is the card available from the Connecticut Genealogical Society? Can you kind of talk about how to access some of these records, and if you need a membership card in a Connecticut Genealogical Society?
Sure, and I would say that that's actually not true. You don't need to be a member of a Connecticut Genealogical Society to access a death record. Deaths and marriage records are public records in Connecticut, but I'm not surprised that a town clerk might have told you that. The things that are restricted are the birth records for 100 years old, and that's the list that I provide in the handout, all of those places. So it's not Connecticut Genealogical Society, it's the Connecticut Society of Genealogists. That's one of them. There's, I think, 12 of them on that total list. So sometimes a clerk might, that specific law that I referred to in one of the earlier slides, you can get the transcription of the full law. That gives you your sort of genealogist right of when looking at public records. Again, you might get a clerk that's not the most pleasant. I've dealt with that plenty of times. I've also dealt with many very pleasant town clerks as well. So you should be allowed to look at them, but it's kind of goes with some of the things. And like what's in the chat panel by Catherine, that is what I'm saying, that it's only for births for 100 years. Sometimes you might get some issues also with marriage records, because starting in the 90s they added Social Security numbers to them, so that creates a process where they're supposed to copy them and black out the Social Security numbers before you're able to look at them. But but for like these really old death records, these are transcription, and I guess you're referring to from Barber. The Barber tries to give as full a transcription as possible. If they're not letting you look at them, you could also just try, if you should be allowed to look at them, but you can also see if the Family Search did also transcribe those vital records through the Family History Library catalog. So you can go on Family Search and then just go to the specific town in Stanford and see if they did do a scan of those early records. But you are supposed to be allowed to look at those records, but they're generally not going to say more than what's in the Barber transcription.
All right. That looks like all the questions. Thank you again, Chris, for your presentation. Catherine mentioned that I believe the handout that I sent as an attachment was truncated, so I will include the full handout. The handout should be 5 pages with a lengthier bibliography with many of the records and references for the court records, some of the military records. So I'll make sure that that's included in my follow-up email to everyone. And the handout on the web page currently, if you've downloaded it from there recently, that should be the full handout as well. So it's 5 pages. All right, and as I mentioned, if we didn't get to your question, of course you can reach out directly to our instructors. You'll find their email addresses both on the handouts as well as on the course webpage. Speaking of the course webpage, of course I've sent that to you a few times by email, but here's the very long, complicated URL. I'll include it once more in my follow-up email this evening once the recording is posted. So I want to thank everyone again for participating in our online course. The last 6 weeks have just flown by, but I do hope that throughout this course you learned about new resources, tools, strategies for researching your family history in any of the New England states, and that you're inspired to dive in. Now's a great time to devote some time to your family history research. I will be sending you an email in the next couple of days or perhaps the next couple of hours with a survey for the course as we strive to improve our online programs. Your feedback is very much appreciated. So we do thank you in advance for taking some time and offering your feedback and suggestions on the course. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I look forward to seeing you online in the future. Goodbye for now.